Welcome to the second SY2 screencast on research methods, and what we're going to look at in this presentation are some of the key issues that influence the research process. Now, there are lots of different ways in which sociologists do their research, but we can generally categorise these approaches according to two dimensions. Firstly, research can either be based on primary data or secondary data or a mixture of both. So primary data refers to information which wasn't present before the research began. So it's new data that's generated by the researcher during the actual process of research. Secondary data, on the other hand, refers to information which already existed before the sociologists started their research. So, for example, that might include data from historical records or from government statistics or records. The other key way in which we can categorise different approaches to sociological research is in terms of whether or not they produce quantitative data or qualitative data. So as we can see here, quantitative methods are those which generate numerical information. So quantitative research methods are used by sociologists when they want to measure or represent some aspect of social life numerically or statistically. Qualitative research methods, in contrast, are those research methods which generate non-numerical data. So qualitative research is about generating rich, in-depth descriptions of social life. So qualitative research methods allow the sociologist to explore the meanings that people give to both their own behaviour and the behaviour of others. And qualitative methods are particularly useful when sociologists need to gather in-depth data from a targeted group of people. So therefore, any research that requires information about people's beliefs, feelings and attitudes is likely to make use of qualitative methods. And this diagram here gives you an indication of the range of methods that sociologists might use in the process of doing their research. Now, the research methods that sociologists decide to use in their research and the way in which they actually go about conducting their research is affected by three broad sets of factors. Firstly, you've got the influence of what we might call practical factors. Then secondly, we've got the influence of ethical or moral issues. And then thirdly, we've got the role of theory. So let's look at each of these issues briefly in turn. So practical issues are those issues that have to be settled before research realistically can be undertaken. And two of the most important practical issues that sociologists have to take into account when they're doing research are time and money. So obviously sociologists, when they're selecting a particular approach to research, need to evaluate whether or not that approach is affordable and whether or not they've got the time to complete it. And furthermore, the choice of research method might also be shaped by the priorities of the funding body. So for example, if sociologists are getting funding from the government, there might be an expectation that their method has to have a practical outcome. In other words, it has to be seen as having a useful impact on society or the economy. Another key practical issue that sociologists will always need to take into account are issues of access. In other words, how do they gain entry into a particular social group or a particular social institution that they wish to research? Okay, let's now look at the second set of issues that influence the choice of research method and the way in which sociologists conduct their research. And this falls under the heading of ethics. So if you look up the term ethics in a dictionary, you'll see that ethics are described as moral principles, beliefs about what is right and wrong. Now, in terms of sociological research, ethics are the moral principles which guide research. And there are four issues that I think are particularly important that come under the headings of harm, consent, deception, and privacy and confidentiality. So firstly, participants should not suffer harm as a result of taking part in sociological research. Secondly, we should try to seek the informed consent of those people who are taking part in our research, get their permission. Thirdly, we shouldn't use research methods that are based on deception. We shouldn't conceal the purposes of the research or our identity from our participants. And then lastly, privacy and confidentiality is the ethical guideline that nothing published should identify individual people or individual institutions. So responses should be anonymised. And to find out more about the ethical guidelines that sociologists are expected to follow within the UK, have a look at the British Sociological Association website, which is the professional body that represents academic sociologists within the UK, and their statement of ethical practice. Okay, and the third set of factors that influence the choice of method are theoretical debates about the best way of producing valid knowledge in a subject like sociology. And many of the earliest sociologists believed that the best way for sociology to produce valid knowledge was to adopt an approach to research that was modelled closely on the principles of the natural sciences. And this scientific approach to doing research is usually referred to as positivism. However, there's also an alternative approach to doing social research that rejects the idea of sociology as a science of society. And this alternative approach is known as interpretivism or anti-positivism. So positivism is the idea that sociology should study human behaviour in fundamentally the same ways as natural scientists study the natural world. So whereas natural scientists try to uncover the underlying causes of natural phenomenon, the job of the positivist sociologist is to identify the underlying causes of social behaviour. So just as plant growth is affected by things like soil type and water and sunshine, social things such as suicide rates from a positivist perspective are affected by whether or not groups are married or divorced, whether or not they live in rural or urban areas, whether or not they're religious or not. And positivism focuses on aspects of social behaviour that can be directly observed and measured. So the preference within this school of thought is for quantitative research methods. And these quantitative research methods enable the sociologists to document correlations in a precise and measurable way. So positivist sociology attempts to measure behaviour by translating it into numbers, and this makes it possible to use statistical tests to measure the strength of relationship between various factors, what we call variables. And we use this term correlation to describe the degree to which two variables are related. So in this graph, we've got two variables. On the horizontal axis, we've got levels of income inequality, so that's the gap between the rich and the poor. And then on the vertical axis, the other variable, the other factor, is life expectancy. And what we can see in this particular graph is there's a very close correlation between levels of income inequality and life expectancy. So the countries that have the lowest levels of income inequality tend to have a higher life expectancy for their population than those countries that have high levels of income inequality. So establishing correlations might help sociologists to establish causal relationships, the idea that one factor causes another. And positivist sociology attempts to explain human behaviour by discovering cause and effect relationships, and it requires data in the form of numbers for this purpose. However, as this cartoon makes clear, correlation does not always equal causation. So two events can consistently correlate with each other, but not necessarily have any causal relationship whatsoever. An example is the relationship between reading ability and shoe size across the whole population. So if somebody bothered to perform such a survey, they would find that the larger shoe sizes correlate with better reading ability, But of course this does not mean that large feet cause good reading skills. Instead, it's caused by the fact that young children have small feet and have not yet been taught to read. So in this case, the two variables are more accurately correlated with a third variable, age. Now, the classic sociological study that follows a positivist approach is Durkheim's study that looked at the underlying social causes of the phenomenon of suicide, and we'll look at this famous study in class. However, as we've already briefly noted, there are some sociologists who reject the idea that sociology can or should be modelled on the principles of the natural sciences. And these sociologists who are opposed to positivism are known as interpretivists or anti-positivists. So interpretivists reject the idea that sociological research should be modelled on the natural sciences. They argue that it's not the job of the sociologist simply to be a detached, neutral observer of things that can be directly measured. Instead, they argue that the job of the sociologist is to get as close as possible to the world of their subjects, to the group that they're studying, so that they can really begin to understand the world as it's experienced by that particular group, from their perspective, through their eyes. And this particular approach to doing research, where sociologists are looking at the meanings that people attach to their social world, this approach to doing research is captured by the concept of Verstehen. So Verstehen is all about empathy, about putting yourself in the shoes of the people that you're trying to research. And from an interpretivist perspective, the best way of achieving this research aim isn't to collect statistics, but instead is to collect more rich, in-depth, qualitative research data using methods like participant observation and in-depth interviews.